We are in the 3rd century BC, in the midst of the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage, two rival powers vying for control of the western Mediterranean. This war was instigated by the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, who decided to invade Italy by land, crossing the Alps with his elephants and troops. Hannibal inflicted several defeats on the Romans in battles such as Lake Trasimene or Cannae, where thousands of Roman soldiers died, including some consuls and praetors. The Romans tried to resist as best as they could and sought a way to counter Hannibal's advance. One of the few generals who managed to defeat Hannibal was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of the consul of the same name, who had died in Hispania at the hands of the Carthaginians. He was an ambitious and brave young man who demonstrated his military talent by conquering Carthago Nova, modern-day Cartagena, the main Carthaginian base in Hispania. The historian Livy wrote that there, he captured the wife and children of Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother, and treated them with respect and courtesy, earning the admiration of his enemies. But Scipio not only had to fight against the Carthaginians but also against his fellow countrymen, who envied and feared him. In Rome, there was strong political opposition, led by Senator Quintus Fabius Maximus, known as the Shield of Rome, who had been appointed dictator to deal with Hannibal using a strategy of attrition and avoiding direct combat. Fabius Maximus considered Scipio an arrogant and reckless young man who jeopardized Rome's security with his audacious and risky plans. Therefore, when Scipio was elected consul for the year 205 BC, Fabius Maximus set a trap for him. He forced him to accept the daunting task of leading the 5th and 6th Legion, which had long been neglected in Sicily. These legions consisted of survivors of the battles of Cannae and Trasimene, who had been sent to Sicily as punishment for their cowardice and defeat. They lived in miserable conditions, without hope or honor, and were considered cursed legions, incapable of fighting again. The historian Polybius described how Fabius Maximus believed that by sending Scipio with these legions, he condemned him to failure and obscurity, thus ridding himself of his rival. But Scipio did not let himself be intimidated by this situation. On the contrary, he saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate his worth and leadership. The general set out to restore the morale and discipline of the cursed legions, transforming them into forces capable of facing the Carthaginians. To achieve this, he employed a series of measures that combined severity with generosity, firmness with compassion, and rigor with ingenuity. He punished deserters and rebels but also rewarded the loyal and the brave. He provided the cursed legions with new uniforms and equipment, taught them new tactics and strategies but also inspired them with his example and charisma. As described by the historian Appian, Scipio achieved what seemed impossible. He turned the cursed legions into blessed legions, willing to follow him to the ends of the earth. And the end of the earth for Scipio was Africa, his ultimate goal. He knew that the only way to end the war was to attack the heart of Carthage, its homeland, and force Hannibal to leave Italy to defend it. But for that, he needed a fleet to cross the sea and land in Africa. And that fleet was in Sicily, under the command of Gaius Laelius, a tribune and admiral in the service of Scipio. Laelius was a loyal friend and an experienced sailor who had participated in the conquest of Carthago Nova. They met in Sicily to prepare the assault on Africa. The general had managed to convince the Roman Senate to grant him permission to carry out his plan, despite the opposition of Fabius Maximus and his allies. Scipio knew he could not waste time because Hannibal remained a threat in Italy, and the Carthaginians could send more reinforcements to Africa. Therefore, in the autumn of 204 BC, Scipio decided to set sail with his legions and fleet, taking advantage of a full moonlit night and favorable wind as described by Polybius. The crossing was smooth and uneventful until they reached the shores of Africa. There, they encountered a surprise. A Carthaginian fleet was waiting for them, ready to prevent their landing. The Carthaginians had been alerted by their spies about Scipio's plans and had prepared an ambush. The Carthaginian fleet outnumbered and outgunned the Roman fleet and had the support of the Numidians, African allies skilled in horseback combat. Scipio ordered Laelius to handle the naval battle while he directed the troops landing on land. The general relied on Laelius's skill in maneuvering the fleet and on the loyalty of the legions to follow him to the end. The battle was tough and bloody, but in the end, Scipio and Laelius managed to defeat the Carthaginians. Laelius broke the enemy formation with a clever strategy, pretending to retreat and then attacking by surprise with his faster and lighter ships. Laelius sank or captured several Carthaginian ships, forcing the rest to flee or surrender. Meanwhile, Scipio managed to land his troops on a beach near the city of Utica, one of the main Carthaginian cities in Africa. Now the Romans had to face the Numidians, who tried to hinder his advance with their horses and spears. The Romans used his heavy infantry to form a defensive line and his light cavalry to counterattack the Numidians. Scipio also had the support of some African allies who had rebelled against Carthage and joined his cause. Among them was Massinissa, the king of the Massili, a Numidian people who had been expelled from their territory by Syphax, the king of the Massili, another Numidian people allied with Carthage. Massinissa was a brave and ambitious young man who admired Scipio and wanted to reclaim his kingdom. Together, they defeated Syphax's Numidians and advanced to Utica. There, they established their camp and began the siege of the city. Before we continue, if you don't want to miss content like this, don't forget to subscribe and click on the bell button, as we will be uploading more content like this. The Romans besieged Utica for several months but failed to capture the city. The Carthaginians defended it bravely and received support from Syphax, who sent more Numidians to reinforce the garrison. Scipio realized that he needed a change in strategy and decided to abandon the siege of Utica and march towards a more significant city, Carthage, the capital of the Carthaginian Empire. Carthage was a wealthy and powerful city, surrounded by the sea on three sides and connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus, which made it easier to defend. The city had also three walls that protected it from enemy attacks and a harbor that allowed it to trade with the world. Carthage was the pride and glory of the Carthaginians, and the symbol of their resistance against Rome. Scipio knew that attacking Carthage was a risky undertaking, but he also knew it was the only way to compel Hannibal to return to Africa and face him in a decisive battle. The general had confidence in his military superiority and believed that his audacity would have a psychological impact on the Carthaginians. He thought that, by seeing the Romans daring to threaten their sacred city, the Carthaginians would lose their morale and courage, surrendering or fleeing. But Scipio was wrong. When the Carthaginians saw the Romans approaching Carthage, they were neither frightened nor discouraged. On the contrary, they became infuriated and mobilized. The Carthaginians organized a fierce and desperate defense, using all available resources to repel the invaders. They recruited all able-bodied men for combat, including women and children, who assisted in weapon production and food transport. Appian describes that the Carthaginians also sought help from their African allies and, most importantly, from Hannibal, to whom they sent an urgent message to return to Africa and save his homeland. Hannibal received the message while in Bruttium, a region in southern Italy where he had established his last refuge. Hannibal had spent over 15 years in Italy, fighting the Romans relentlessly and without a definitive victory. Hannibal had lost a significant portion of his troops and allies and had witnessed his brothers Hasdrubal and Mago die in battle. He gathered his surviving soldiers, about 20,000 men, including infantry and cavalry, and embarked his troops on a fleet of 60 ships sent by Carthage to pick him up. Hannibal sailed across the Mediterranean Sea until he reached the shores of Africa, where he landed near Hadramedum, an ally of Carthage. There, he met with other Carthaginian generals, such as Hasdrubal Gisco or Sophonisba, the daughter of Hasdrubal the Fair and the wife of Syphax. Together, they formed an army of about 50,000 men, ready to confront Scipio and his legions. Thus, the stage was set for the final battle of the Second Punic War, which took place in the year 202 BC in a place called Zama, as Livy explains. The Battle of Zama was the definitive showdown between Scipio the African and Hannibal Barca, the two best generals of their time. It was an epic battle that determined the fate of Rome and Carthage and marked the end of the Second Punic War. Scipio and Hannibal met on a flat field near the city of Zama, in present-day Tunisia, although today the consensus is that the battle was most likely fought near a place called Naragara. According to the ancient sources, Scipio had about 30,000 men, including 6,100 cavalry and 24,000 infantry. Hannibal had about 40,000 or 50,000 men, including 4,000 cavalry and 36,000 or 46,000 infantry. He also had 80 war elephants. Scipio mixed his Roman and African infantry in the first two lines, creating a checkerboard pattern that allowed more space and mobility for his troops. In the third line were the veteran legionaries as a reserve. He also placed his cavalry on both wings, with the Numidians under Massinissa on the right and the Romans under Laelius on the left. Hannibal placed his mercenaries in the first line, followed by his Carthaginians in the second line and his veterans from Italy in the third line. He also placed his cavalry on both wings, with the Numidians under Hasdrubal on the right and the Carthaginians on the left. He placed his elephants in front of his army, hoping to break through the Roman lines. The battle began with the advance of Hannibal's elephants, which aimed to sow panic and chaos among the Roman ranks. But Scipio was prepared for this attack and had devised a way to neutralize it. The general ordered his troops to blow their trumpets and horns loudly to scare the elephants and make them flee or go out of control. The Romans had also left gaps between his units so that the elephants could pass through without causing harm. Thus, Scipio managed to make the elephants more of a problem for Hannibal than for himself. After the failure of the elephants, the combat between the light infantry began. Romans and Africans faced the mercenaries with their swords and javelins. The battle was fierce and evenly matched, but in the end, the Romans and Africans managed to prevail and push back the mercenaries. Then the heavy infantry came into action, forming the core of both armies. The Romans advanced with their typical formation, the maniple, which consisted of small units of 120 men each, armed with swords, javelins, and shields. The Carthaginians awaited them with their typical formation, the crescent, a curved line of soldiers armed with shields and short swords. The battle turned into a bloody duel between the two heavy infantries, which struck and stabbed mercilessly. Appian described how the dead and wounded piled up on the ground, while the survivors continued to fight furiously. The battle seemed to have no end or victor. But then something decisive happened. The Roman cavalry returned to the battlefield. The Roman cavalry had chased Syphax's Numidian cavalry to the horizon, where it had managed to defeat or scatter them. Then it had returned to the main battle site to support Scipio. The Roman cavalry was commanded by Laelius and Massinissa, Scipio's two friends and allies. Laelius and Massinissa attacked the Carthaginian army from the rear, catching them completely off guard. The Roman and African riders charged the Carthaginians with their spears and swords, causing great slaughter. The Carthaginians found themselves surrounded on all sides, with no possibility of escape or resistance. Many of them died on the spot, others surrendered or fled. Only a few managed to stand their ground, including Hannibal and his personal guard. Hannibal saw that the battle was lost and that there was nothing to be done. He decided to retreat with his men to the south. Hannibal had been defeated for the first time in his life, but he had not been captured or killed. Hannibal retained his honor and hope as described by Livy. Scipio saw that the battle was won and that he had achieved his goal. The general ordered his troops to stop pursuing the Carthaginians and to celebrate their victory. Publius Cornelius Scipio had defeated Rome's greatest enemy and had put an end to the war. The general was given the honorific name Africanus by the Roman Senate in 201 BC, after he returned to Rome and celebrated his triumph. Thus ended the Battle of Zama, which, as Polybius puts it, was the conclusion of the Second Punic War and the beginning of a new era for Rome and the world. If you've made it this far, I appreciate your time and dedication. Please take a moment to show your support by hitting that like button and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.